In 5, 4.
So much pressure.
3, 2, 1. There you go.
Hey, thanks, Will. Welcome to the Salt Lake.net user group. It's great to have everyone here tonight. If I click on the right thing here, our slides will progress. So here's our agenda for the night. As you may be aware, we're going to learn about Pulumi, which every time I say it, I feel like it's some kind of Italian noodle. I might be a little bit disappointed if we don't get Italian noodles tonight, but we'll see. Before we get started though, there's just a couple of housekeeping items. At the end of the evening, we're going to send out a link for our speaker feedback. That helps our speakers a lot. It helps us a lot to know if we're getting good content. Also, it's how you'll enter the prize entry for the night. We do have some great prizes for door prizes, I guess. Also, we have a YouTube channel. It's great. We are looking at our YouTube channel stats and seeing that a lot of people are finding some good content, spending time listening to it. So please subscribe, enjoy the content, send it to your friends.
Feel free to thumbs up this episode for all algorithm fun.
Yes, because yes, we know it's going to be great. So thumbs up it. As you have questions tonight, feel free to use the Zoom chat or the YouTube chat. We will be monitoring both. Jim, for your convenience, we can filter those questions to you so that you don't have to be watching those. But yeah, feel free to put those questions in either location. We want to thank our sponsors. As you know, we have sponsors that provide prizes, sometimes a location, sometimes food. Not necessarily tonight, but our sponsors do help us make these things happen. Our presentation. So Jim comes to us from the far off land of San Diego. We're fortunate for the interweb for bringing him here to us tonight. He's an experienced software developer, and I don't know why I'm calling this part out, but he's obviously a master gardener because he spends a lot of time on his lawn and his sprinkler system. So anyway, he's going to talk to us tonight about Pulumi and the CI/CD pipeline. And with that, Jim, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. And I actually don't know if it's pronounced Pulumi or Pulumi. I always thought it was Pulumi. And the sprinkler thing, I mean, that should be obvious, right? Like I'm all about the pipelines.
I get it. Nice tie-in.
Yeah. All right, so let's see if I can share the right screen here. Oh boy, open system preferences. Yes, I want to do it. Oh, okay. Looks like it wants me to restart Zoom to share my screen. That is, I guess, something that needs to happen. So I'll be right back.
Well, this is the part where you get on and you do a little dance or something. Maybe you
This is
tell
where I
some of
rap,
those
but
dad
he's already
jokes.
back. I don't think I can do that.
Oh, rats. That was fast.
I know, you had your moment. You blew it.
Yeah.
Do we need to make him a co-host again so he can share? Hang on.
Yeah, I got online early. We just spent all time gabbing.
I know, we're horrible. All right.
All right, let's try this again. All right, hopefully you guys can see that mess on my screen. And so, like we said, tonight we're going to talk about the beginner's guide to Pulumi within CI/CD pipelines. And I am definitely a beginner when it comes to Pulumi. Like I said, I don't even really know how to pronounce it. So, but I'm not a beginner when it comes to cloud and DevOps architect. That's what I do day in and day out. I started off life as a C# developer. Actually, if I'm being completely honest, I started off as a VB.NET developer. But at some point I had to bite the bullet and move on to C#. And at some point I evolved into somebody who was more interested in building the systems and the software. So I've been doing a lot of work in infrastructure and DevOps space over the last few years. I think probably CI/CD pipelines were one of the things that set me on that path. I always thought it was like one of the coolest things, coolest ideas to have something automatically build your code and run all your tests or whatever checks. I used to be a big fan of things like style cop and FX cop back in the day. And I think my first build server was a cruisecontrol.net server that I just installed on a computer beneath my desktop without asking anybody for permission. And so that was about 10 or maybe 11 years ago. And I've been playing around with CI/CD ever since then. So tonight I plan on talking a little bit about how Pulumi works, how any kind of infrastructure as code system might work. And then we'll take a look at a basic DevOps pipeline and a slightly more enterprisey example. I think there's a lot more for me personally to learn about Pulumi and its differences from infrastructure as code systems I've used before. So like I said, this is definitely a beginner's example, and there's definitely a lot more to learn after this. So the basics of how Pulumi works, it's an infrastructure as code tool, and you end up executing this cycle where you write some code that represents your infrastructure, and you'll ask Pulumi what it thinks you wrote your code like. So, you know, what does Pulumi think will happen to your infrastructure if you write this code, if you execute this code? So Pulumi will tell you what it thinks about that. It's your job to review it and decide whether or not you think it's a good idea to make those changes to the infrastructure. I mean, whatever Pulumi tells you is what it's going to go out and try to do, but it doesn't necessarily know whether any of that is a good idea. But once you tell it that it's a good idea, it performs the update and it actually goes out and deploys things to the cloud, or not the cloud. Like infrastructure code systems can be used to manage like VMware on premise, or a variety of cloud services. But mostly I'm interested in showing you some examples with Azure. Infrastructure as code, like a lot of times you'll see a cycle like this. Other tools like Terraform use a very similar cycle. They can be, but you don't necessarily have to adopt this tool. I mean, I'd be happier if you just had some scripts as opposed to doing it by hand. But you do get a lot of advantages from using like this workflow engine that figures out the dependencies between your different pieces of infrastructure, and that will keep track of like what you've already got out there, right? Like it automatically calculates those dependencies, figures out what's missing. You don't have to write a bunch of, for example, if statements that say, if this thing is not already deployed, then please deploy it. Otherwise, skip this block. Most people that I've worked with who try to just say, hey, we already know PowerShell or something, let's just write a bunch of PowerShell scripts, eventually start writing like a poor man's system that ends up looking like Pulumi, but not as good, or ends up looking like Terraform, but not as good. So it's these things are kind of common problems that it makes sense for you to adopt a tool to solve them for you. So one big difference between Pulumi and some of the other tools that are out there, specifically really Terraform is the other big one, is that Pulumi, like from the get-go, was designed to use languages that you already know. So In the case of the example here in the screenshot, it's using C# to define the infrastructure, but it's kind of a pluggable system. So you could use TypeScript, Python, Go. I mean, I don't mention Node, but it's kind of implied by the TypeScript. So you don't have to use TypeScript. You could use Node.js in any of its flavors. This is great, not just in terms of like you already know the language, but that the entire stack, the entire tool set is available to you. So, you know, when you're working with Pulumi and you've chosen C# as your language, and you want to share like a module or something with another team, then that can be distributed as a NuGet package. You can edit this in, you know, VS Code using all the same IntelliSense and checking that you are used to using. And to some extent, you can use things like unit tests and static analysis against the same that you're used to. That tool set is at least potentially available, where when you're using ARM or CloudFormation or Terraform, you're more locked into their specific languages and tools, and you don't necessarily have the opportunity to use everything that you're used to and that mature ecosystem that exists. In fact, I built most of these demos using GitHub code spaces. So, you know, again, that's like just an example of like, you can just go out there and use everything that the ecosystem provides. So your typical like Pulumi workflow when you are, again, just sitting down and using the tool is that you run your program, right? So you've written your code, you run the program, it gets built if your language requires it. You know, if you're using Python or JavaScript, that's not going to happen. Pulumi thinks about, or as it processes your program, it notices that whenever you request new resources. So like if we go back to this, like we'll see a new resource group declared here. And so as it processes that, it turns that into a request that it sends to the deployment engine. Like, and so it says, okay, look, this guy looks like he wants a resource group. So the deployment engine registers the fact that a resource group is needed. And then as more resources are processed through the system, they get sent to the deployment engine as well as with their dependencies. So if you're going to deploy a VM into that resource group, it's going to say, I'm expecting this resource group to exist. And then the deployment engine starts building a tree of resources to figure out what needs to be deployed. And that ends up being shown back to you as a plan, or Pulumi calls them a preview. So it'll print out something to the console that says, you know, this is what I'm going to build, this is what I'm going to change, and these are the things I'm going to get rid of. And if you decide that all of those things are a good idea, you can tell Pulumi yes, and it will go ahead and try and make those changes for you. And if you think it looks like not what you expected, you can say no, and it'll just abort and not change anything. So maybe this isn't as controversial, but I still feel like talking about it because I remember when I was first starting to work with infrastructure-as-code, you know, I would make the suggestion that, hey, you know, we could run this in a pipeline, and people would be like, well, that's nutty. You know, that could never be safe. And I think there was just a little bit of unfamiliarity with tooling back then. That's probably 3 or 4 years ago. But it is true that Pulumi can't decide for you whether or not what you're proposing is safe or a good idea. It totally depends on you to make that decision. And so it's your responsibility, you know, to think about what it's showing you and make a good decision about whether or not it's a good idea to deploy that. And so, you know, kind of what we see here in this screenshot, and we'll see in a minute in a demo, is that, you know, it's telling us, this happens to be a destroy plan, that it's going to go ahead and pretty much destroy everything that we've deployed. And we have the option to say no to that, or yes, if it's a good idea. And so the first demo that I'm going to show, I'm just going to deploy something very simple. It's just going to be what the last screenshot showed me destroying. It's going to be a resource group, and it's going to have a couple of storage accounts in it. So like I said, all of this is running in GitHub code spaces. Would work just as well, locally on my machine in a regular instance of Visual Studio, or some JetBrains tools, or VS Code, any tool that you can expect to edit C# code with, you can edit this project with. All of this code, of course, is in GitHub, and I have the link at the end that we can share out. But getting started was fairly easy. I just created a directory. Pulumi gives us, various templates that it can spin up for us. So I just told it I wanted a Azure-oriented C# project, and it asked me a few questions, and ended up creating a relatively simple stack. So it created this program for me, which is just telling Pulumi to run my stack, and my stack is a class, so it looks like a fairly familiar C# class, and I create a couple of storage accounts with it. So to deploy this, I could start very naively. I could just say like Pulumi up, right? So up being short for update. And I'm kind of surprised that it worked. I was expecting it to ask me to log in. Logging in pretty much comprises of just like providing an API key for Pulumi.com to the system. But that's okay. I must have logged in earlier and forgot about it. Over on Pulumi.com, we can see that, it's keeping track of my stack. It's kind of right now telling us the same information that it just told us on the command line over here. So we can see the summary. We can look at the detailed diffs, right? Which are telling us the details about each of the storage accounts that it's about to deploy. And there's a little bit more information about the configuration and the environment for the stack. I can get a lot of the same information here. If I go to details, it prints out the detailed diff. And if I decide these changes are good, just say yes, and it'll get to work deploying them. And over in Azure, you should see things appear. The resource group has been created. It's not that one. And it'll take a second to finish. I think that one that was out there is just an earlier version. So you can see I've got a couple of different subscriptions here. So I'll just filter out that one. And so currently Pulumi is pointed at this MSDN subscription. And so it just created this resource group. And by default, Pulumi always likes to put some random information at the end of your resources. You can disable that, but the idea is that really the source of truth is your stack, and if you shouldn't necessarily care too much about the name, and it does make it convenient if there's some randomization of the name. If Pulumi decides that it needs to create a new copy of this side by side, or if it's creating a new copy while it's in the process of deleting the old copies. Having said that, a lot of teams will want to have tight control over their names, and so like I said, we could tell Pulumi not to do that, but then we have to maybe do some more reasoning about what it means if there's a name collision and the order of operations. So these storage accounts, again, they're not super interesting. I probably would just point out this tag right here, which is that both these resources ended up being tagged with this dev tag, which is a product, of course, of how the code works, of how the code is written. We can see right here, we have the dev tag applied to the storage account. And actually, the storage account arguments are defined once and then passed to each of these storage accounts. So really, these storage accounts are exact clones of each other, just as you would expect, and the only difference ends up being the name between them. So again, that's very easy to see that we're using kind of standard C# semantics. Like we can create objects and we can pass them to multiple instances. We can pull out functions. We can make entire class libraries or NuGet packages and reuse code that way as well. So if I want to make a change, I might do something like, just change this tag to like demo. And the next time I run Pulumi, it will notice that change. You can see that it recompiled the program. And again, it's going to do that every time for C# because it is a C# program. Like I said, I started off as a C# guy. I think that you'll see a lot of examples of Pulumi with TypeScript or something like this, but I just can't get away from my basic love of C#. So all the JavaScript people need to get off my lawn. So it does tell us when it prints out this preview that the difference is in the tags, right? But if that wasn't enough for us, again, we can go down to details and we can see exactly that it is changing dev to demo if we give it permission to do so. And so we can say yes to that. And it runs the build again and begins making the changes.
Hey, Jim, we do have a question.
Sure.
If there's a name collision, will Pulumi just flag it as a possible update instead of a create?
Well, no, I think it'll be an error, right? So Pulumi and Terraform are currently very closely related in that although Pulumi gives us the whole language processing engine, and it has its own engine for calculating what needs to happen, when it comes down to actually communicating with Azure, they just use the same exact open source providers that Terraform uses. So they're at the moment piggybacking on the work that Terraform did in front of them. And so if you try and deploy something that's got the exact same name and there's a collision, Pulumi may or may not detect that collision for you, but when you get to the point of approving the deployment and send that request to Azure, Azure will definitely tell you that that's not allowed. Like it'll tell you that resource already exists. And in the current versions of the Terraform Azure provider, that's an error. It won't just automatically adopt the old resource without you explicitly bringing it into your stack. So yeah, again, there's a slide later on where I kind of point out that you as a human looking at your code, you have your opinion of what that code is going to do. When we look at Pulumi's preview here, that's its opinion of what you're telling it to do, and it's probably more correct than you are, right? Especially since it's the one that's actually going to go out and make those changes. But Azure ends up having the final word. Like if Azure doesn't want to do what you're asking to do, it's not going to happen. So it doesn't really matter if you and Pulumi both agree that it's a good idea. Azure still has the final word and whether or not anything changes. So, I mean, just let me know if there's any follow-up questions to that. I think where we were was double checking these tags. So like we shouldn't see anything tagged with dev anymore here. That's weird. Did I not tell it to go? Nope, it said it updated. So let's really wants me to know about those credits. Back out a little bit. That's the wrong subscription. Try this one. That's the right one. So yeah, so now we see that it changed the tag to demo right there. And so that's your basic Pulumi workflow. So like, you know, given that I'm in an environment where it's my environment, I'm allowed to do everything I have permission, right? I'm logged in as myself. I'm the owner of the subscription. I have no problem with me making these changes directly from the command line. I'm able to do everything right from here, right? Including destroy the infrastructure or destroy the infrastructure. So Pulumi really quickly, like when I asked it to destroy really quickly, you know, figured out that it needs to destroy these items. And it's cheating a little bit because it has a copy of the current state. And so it just looked in the state and said, well, if you want to destroy everything, then this is the stuff I need to destroy. So I'll just say no for now. If I tell it to refresh first, it might still be pretty quick. But what it will actually do is now it's actually asking Azure, so does any of this stuff really exist? And you know, Azure said yes, you know, this stuff does exist. And so Pulumi ends up coming with the same plan, which is, you know, to destroy all these things. So let's go ahead and do that now and just clean up that first example. And while that runs, I'll pop back over to the slides. It should be gone shortly. So there's a double-edged sword, of course, with what we just saw, which is that it feels really safe because I was there the whole time. I was there to review the plan and decide if it's a good idea. So the pitfall, I mean, the downside though, is that I can't always be there in the real world, right? When we want to run stuff in the pipeline, I'm not going to be sitting at the build agent able to answer yes or no to Pulumi. So the challenge with taking infrastructure code tool and putting in a pipeline is to figure out how to make it non-interactive. And they usually have an option which just says, hey, just do it, you know, just automatically say yes. But again, that sacrifices the safety, right? If we're not looking at the plan, we don't really know what it's going to do. And like I said, I don't have a high level of confidence in my ability to, you know, read the code and know for sure what it's going to do. I much prefer to have Pulumi tell me what it thinks I'm trying to ask it to do before I tell it to run off and start making the changes to infrastructure. Because I mean, obviously the nightmare scenario is just like, well, we destroyed everything now, you know, the CEO is really mad at me because we don't have a system anymore. But there's subtler things that can go wrong, like, you know, oh, you know, we opened the firewall and, you know, now we're completely exposed in terms of like, you know, hackers and stuff like that. So playing around with infrastructure, you know, has these real world consequences, like, you know, a company goes bankrupt or you lose your job or both, right? So when we work with pipelines and we're working on something like a, you know, a .NET code or our Node.js spa or whatever, we have a lot of techniques that we put, a lot of tools that we put in those pipelines to give us confidence that the code is of a high quality, that it doesn't have bugs, that it doesn't have security vulnerabilities. And we have other things we do to make deploying changes safe. Like we might have feature flags to turn off the feature, and so it can be deployed, but it's not going to cause us any problems. But again, we have static analysis, tests, other things. When we look at other infrastructure as code tools like Terraform, it's pretty much bare bones. Like that ecosystem is beginning to develop things like unit tests and feature flags, but it's difficult. Now, when we look at Pulumi, we're using the same set of tools and that we have with our normal language stacks, and so feature flags and unit testing and analysis become a lot more, I guess they feel a lot more achievable because we know we've done those things with our other code bases written in these languages. So I do know that Pulumi can support these things, but again, this is kind of the beginner's level. Where I'm at is that I can't tell you like the magic formula for all those things. So I still feel that like where I'm at, like review is still the key. So how do we make Pulumi non-interactive, but still give ourselves the opportunity to review what it says it's going to do? So another, probably one of the most uncomfortable things about Pulumi for me right now is that whereas we have this idea in Terraform that it can produce a plan for us and save that plan, and then we can execute that plan at any time later, and it will be exactly what we thought the plan was being. Pulumi doesn't do that, right? So Pulumi doesn't have the concept of saving a plan. As we saw when we deployed, even after I said yes to the deployment, it rebuilt the program and rebuilt the plan, and then executed the second plan that had built. So theoretically, if I had been thinking about it a really, really long time, it might have made changes other than what the first preview showed me, because the infrastructure might have changed while I was sitting there thinking. So that was really uncomfortable for me for a while. I had to do a lot of thinking about that. And what I came up with, and kind of based on some of the examples that I was building off of in the Pulumi docs, was that we can kind of use a branching strategy to both enforce reviews and control the flow of changes into the infrastructure. So like we would normally do in any system, and even with Terraform, we would make topic branches and do our work in progress over there. And when we were ready, we would merge into a development branch. The development branch would never really be for deployment. We would use it for kind of an integration and staging. Like the whole point of the development branch and this idea is it gives the whole development team a chance to review that work in progress as it finishes, and review like again, what Pulumi says will change if that code is merged. And so we would require PRs to that branch, and we would require validation builds so that we would be able to have not only the code changes in that PR available, but the Pulumi plan that's associated with those. And once the team decided to merge to that development branch, they would, it would get merged in, but nothing else would really happen at that point. That's the staging aspect of this branch. So this is now like something that we're planning to deploy at some point. It is the new baseline. So the whole team, if they've got other open topic branches, should pull this in. But other than that, it just sits there waiting for the next step, which is to go into the main branch. So at some point, someone's going to make a decision that these changes actually need to go out to infrastructure, and that would happen by a merge to the main branch. And the main branch would just automatically deploy once a merge happened to it. So we could pick the head of the development branch. We could pick one of the intervening commits from the last time we deployed. But we would still want to require PRs on this main branch. And because we want to review now the final integrated state, like whatever 2 or 3 things we've decided to hold off on until our next deployment window, for example, we want to see that plan before we decide to actually deploy it. So that PR waits for people to approve it. And once it's merged to main, Pulumi automatically goes out and starts making changes. Another thing, this is an idea that I kind of put in there because one time I did a merge and like Azure DevOps didn't notice, like no build kicked off. So I was like, well, now I would have to do this whole branching strategy and this whole two-phase commit merge thing just to deploy. So I decided to add a manual deploy flag to the branch or to the pipeline. But again, that maybe is not a good idea in the real world. I'm not too sure about it, especially if you're under kind of like strict control over how to over the order of things to deploy and who should be allowed to approve that. Like just setting a variable might not be a good idea if anyone can do that. So it's definitely something to think about. And like I said, like I was kind of alluding to earlier, code reviews are super important. You definitely want to continue doing code reviews as you work with Pulumi or any infrastructure as code. But we sometimes mistake, what we think the code is going to do, right? That's why we have bugs in the first place. But the Pulumi preview tells you what Pulumi thinks you're asking it to do, and it's what it's going to do if you actually let it run. So you should really be doing both, and that's part of the strategy of getting those validation builds done, is that you'll have the preview and the code side by side, where you can review both before you make your decision whether A, it's good to put in the staging queue, which is our develop, or whether it's good to actually go out. Do we have any more questions? So again, just to make it abundantly clear, like I'm a beginner, but like the way that I'm looking at it right now, the merge to main is the approval, right? Like that's what everyone needs to understand, that there's no other approval. There's no other waiting for it to say yes, because you're not going to be available there to say yes. And the way that we're working, we don't really have an artifact to pass on to something like a release pipeline for approval the way we would with a Terraform plan. So for the next example, I'm going to go ahead and get our Pulumi project running under a pipeline that kind of works the way I described. And again, this is based off of some docs, some samples that Pulumi provided. And then the rest of it is just me trying to figure out what they were thinking when they wrote their pipeline that way. But the infrastructure that we'll put out this time is a little bit more interesting, perhaps. It's just a virtual machine inside of a resource group, and it's on a network, and it has an IP and the network security group and stuff. So in this stack, again, kind of started the same way with like, Pulumi new and stuff like that. And then from there, I actually took an old Terraform example that I had for deploying these type of resources. And I line by line converted them into Pulumi. And so we have, kind of starting off the same, we're creating a resource group. And then there was a lot of, again, this may not be perfectly factored or elegant, but I just wanted to show, the idea that we could pull out some of our own methods, right? So it's a lot of stuff related to creating a virtual network, right? And so I'm just going to give it this common suffix and pass it the resource group that it should live in. I could have, maybe set that as a property or something and just access it that way, but I just happened to, I think, use the refactoring tools, and that's what it gave me, and that's what I went with. And this one is this one's the virtual network one. So it's a variety of resources that are related to the virtual network. And the kind of pattern with Pulumi is always like kind of create the resource. The name is usually, called out as an independent argument, and then some kind of object that represents all the different options that Azure gives you when configuring these things. So, you know, a subnet, there's the network security group, there's a rule that allows SSH. And then this is just a plain old C# object that I created, right? It turned out that I needed these two pieces of information. So I just, you know, kind of did it a little bit old school, and I built my own little POCO for handing that back to the main function, to the main program, and then pass that networking information into the virtual machine, because the virtual machine kind of wanted to know, you know, what subnet it should deploy into. So again, these are just, some of these things are just implementation details of the virtual machine. I could have, instead of just having this be a function, I could have made it into a class, right? And that it just has these as implementation details. But we can see that it's consuming the network in a couple of places, the subnet ID and a security group ID. And then it spins up our VM. So, you know, when we make changes to this right now, so right now I'm on a branch, right? I'm on this demo 1 branch, and GitHub should be all, and Azure DevOps should be all configured to trigger, right? So I'm using some, you know, branch protection policies to enforce the need for PR, right? So if I want to merge to develop from this branch, then this, you know, GitHub calls them checks, but this pipeline needs to run and succeed. And, you know, that pipeline is defined over in Azure DevOps. So again, it just, all this code could easily live in Azure DevOps, but I didn't want to have to keep the 2 repos in sync, and plus I couldn't use code spaces if I was running in DevOps right now. So, but the pipeline that actually runs over there in DevOps, if we take a look at it, is fairly simple. To me, it looks super simple, again, because I'm used to Terraform pipelines, which have a lot more steps in them. But we have a couple of triggers, right? This top trigger is the CI/CD pipeline trigger. So this one is hooked up to the main branch. And so when we make our final merge to main, this trigger is the one that fires. And that's important because the steps down below are keyed off of how they were triggered. And so each of those, the main and development branches are requiring PR builds. So this is the PR trigger to do the validation builds. And this varies kind of by your repo. Like this little PR block won't work if your pipeline is in Azure DevOps. This is kind of a GitHub special feature, like, or a special like way to make this work with GitHub. Azure DevOps has another way to configure that. There's a few variables that we pass in. So the Pulumi access token, which again, we didn't see in the first example because I was already logged in, but the Pulumi access token gives us access to the backend over here at pulumi.com. And then, you know, my service connection, which gives this pipeline access into Azure to make changes, and just the stack name so that it can find itself on pulumi.com, and then just where to find the actual code to run in this pipeline. And Pulumi provides a Azure DevOps task, which makes it pretty convenient. But like I said, the example that we're working with here kind of relies on these conditions to determine like what's going to happen. So, you know, if our build was a pull request, right, then this is just going to, then this top task is going to run, and it's going to create a preview, and that's it, right? And that preview will end up being visible to us in the logs, and we can review it there. And if it fails for any reason, and kind of the only reason if it was invalid in some way, it might fail, then of course your pull request will be blocked, but usually doesn't fail because all it's doing is creating a preview. And likewise, if we just went over here and click the run button, that would show up as a manual run. And as long as I didn't set this this one variable, this manual deploy variable to true, then it would, you know, again, only create a preview. So this is all we get when we're doing our PRs. When we finally get to the merge to main, we get either, an individual CI or a batch CI. These will always be batch CIs because, as I said, batch true up there. And then what it's going to do is it's going to give that magic argument of yes, which just says, you know what, I've looked at the plan enough, go ahead and just run it. And then we have, a skip preview just because, like, again, I'm not going to look at this preview because I've looked at it already when we did the PR build to main. So if that makes sense, then, we can take a look at what will happen if we actually make a change and commit it, right? So right now we should see that Pulumi has nothing to show us, right? Should be empty stack right now. And this is the wrong directory. Let's go over here. One more. Again, we're still using the app.pulumi.com backend here. You can see that everything needs to be created. So I could, again, create it here, but like, let's just pretend for a minute that I'm not allowed to do that, or that my user, like, this will fail because I don't have the permissions to do that, and that we're saying that everybody needs to deploy through these pipelines. So I'm just going to go ahead and say no to that. And at this point, I'm going to make a change just for the sake of making a change. So I'm going to take this super cool password and I'm going to make it more secure, right? So now I would commit this change, right? Again, I can use all my normal tools to do that. I'll just get rid of that other demo change, but I'll keep the one I just did. And obviously, this is a horrible thing to do, to put the password in here. Pulumi does give us ways to securely pass passwords in. And it even does a great job of encrypting that if we tell it that it should be a secret. But again, this is just a kind of beginner's guide right now. So we make our password more secure. And we can push that up. I think we'll have to publish it. Nah, I think I already published the branch. And then once that gets up there, I can also go ahead and open a pull request for it here. And I want to pull into development. And I'll just use the latest commit message. And so that should appear here. And so now I'm basically expecting that it's going to kick off that commit, this pipeline. So GitHub's currently in status of waiting for that pipeline to run. And back here in Azure DevOps, we can see that it's getting started. Again, we can see that, the Pulumi task is kind of running through everything it needs to do, including like installing Pulumi and getting us logged in, and then running our preview. I find like Pulumi's like detailed diff view a little bit hard to kind of parse. Maybe I'm not just used to it yet, but if you don't tell it to do the diff view, then it gives you the very brief summary. And so it's not really good enough in terms of like being able to review it in detail, at least here in the pipeline. Again, you can, if you are using Pulumi.com as your backend, you can go there and review the changes, right? Just this one now. But so after reviewing this, I'm going to look at all this, and it's all brand new stuff because we're starting from an empty deployment. So we're just going to say that this looks good. And over in GitHub, we can see that the check is passed. So we'll go ahead and merge it to develop. Which again is not going to kick off any changes for us, right? So it's just going to be merged to develop, and nothing's going to happen unless we do a pull request into main. So once we start this pull request, just say development to main, then it's going to kick off another build for us to review. So again, the idea that like we're kind of doing this two-phase thing, I mean, it feels like overkill when we're doing it this way. And for a single person, in some sense, it is. Like, I mean, a single developer working alone on their infrastructure is definitely like doing a great job in terms of like avoiding the problems of like manual configuration, and if they're just using Pulumi Interactive from the pipeline. But the idea is we're pretending that I'm part of a team, and that people are gonna, other than myself, are gonna review these things, and that I'm not gonna deploy them immediately after merging them. That there's more process around this. So for a single developer, it is a bit of overkill, but for a team working together, it begins to make a little bit more sense. So this pipeline should be running again. And so it finished. So this is the next build. And again, this is going to look, because it's just the same commit moving over, exactly the same. So there's no need for us to kind of belabor it, but we can go ahead and merge it. And that should kick off the pipeline to do deployment. So this time it skipped the preview stage and it ran straight into the deployment. I think this particular pipeline is actually configured to go to the other subscription. So go to this one. We should see some resource groups appearing as it gets its work done. It's going a little slow. Okay, there we go. I don't know if you guys work with Azure DevOps, but it's been having a hard week. So just like keeping my fingers crossed that doesn't decide to go down again. So this time it's actually running through these creates, making these changes. So it makes this Pulumi resource group, and it should take, usually takes Azure about 90 seconds or so to spin up a Linux VM, so it shouldn't take too long. And it's building stuff. And so we should also be able to see some activity. Over here, we can see the Pulumi.com is also tracking this activity as it goes, and giving us a little bit nicer view of what's been created already. Yeah, it looks like everything is up. So this branch should be gone now, right? So if I want to get over to the next branch, and go over to our next folder just to be ready for that. So while we just let that finish, I'll just hop back over to slides because we are running a little bit short of time, I think. So, so let's talk a little bit about a slightly more enterprisey solution. I love the fact that Pulumi has some smart defaults, right? So usually with Terraform, we have to go through the whole process of configuring remote state, but with Pulumi, that's the default, right? It wants to encourage you to use Pulumi.com. You know, that makes business sense for them, but it's great for us because kind of sets us off on the right track right away. So that's an easy to use option. You know, the other thing they give us by using Pulumi.com is, you know, those encryption keys. I said it had ways of encrypting sensitive data that's also managed by the Pulumi service. So you get remote stack storage, you get someplace to hide your keys, and that's all good. And it works well, but it has two drawbacks, and one of them is it's not free. I mean, it's free for what we're doing right now. But if you have a team and you need things like RBAC controls and, you know, determining who can deploy what stack and who can access different pieces of infrastructure, then you're going to need to go to at least their smallest plan. And of course, their biggest plan, the price on that is, you know, call us and find out. And also, if you want to get off the internet, like it's a SaaS offering, and for some companies, that's just kind of a no-go. Right? They want to, you know, the data inside of a Pulumi stack is sensitive, right? It's a complete map of your infrastructure. Hackers would love to know all that stuff. And so for some companies, that's just a no-go. They want that sensitive data closer to home. They want it either on-prem or they want it in a virtual network that they control. So that being on the internet's a disadvantage for those kinds of companies. And you can get the Pulumi service and self-host it, but again, the only tier that I saw that allowed you to do that was the enterprise tier, the tier of calling us and ask. So the good news is that Pulumi does have the concept of a self-managed stack, which basically means you figure out the answers to like where you're going to store this stuff and how you're going to protect those keys. And it integrates with all the major cloud providers, so GCP, AWS, and in our case, Azure. So we can spin up our own Azure storage account, and we get all the advantages that storage accounts give us, like encryption at rest and you know, secure access only, you know, all the RBAC we could want through Azure AD, and even syncing that onto our on-prem AD. You know, soft deletes in case we want to recover older versions of our stack, and of course the storage account provides a basic firewall that's limited in capacity, but it can limit it to your own private networks, or the newer private endpoint feature, which can take that storage account completely off the internet for those companies who just want to make sure there's absolutely no way in. And configuring Pulumi to use that, it was relatively simple. You know, first we had to, there's a bootstrapping step there. You can't use kind of Pulumi to create its own backend. So I just dug up a script I had for creating storage accounts. And so I created that, and I turned up all the security features that were reasonable for a demo like this. Like I didn't go down the road of private link or anything like that. And then you just have to let Pulumi know about that account. And Pulumi is primarily looking for that information in environment variables. So you set Azure storage account and to let it know where the account is and the storage key so that it can get authorized into that account. And then there's a passphrase, like the second default after you've opted out of app.pulumi.com is passphrase protection for your sensitive data. So it's going to prompt you, you know, hey, what's the passphrase that you want to use? and then you log in, but instead of using an API key for Pulumi, you tell it that you have a cloud URL that points it at a container inside your storage account. And if all these variables are set in the environment, it'll find everything it needs and log you in, and you'll be ready to do Pulumi up or preview or destroy. So the first thing, since again, this was kind of newer to me, that I wanted to do was figure out, what this experience looked like when working just interactively with Pulumi. So we can get rid of one of these windows. And so I made another copy of my pipeline project and said, okay, this is the one I'm going to change to make it work with the backend. And so I need to log out of my old session with Pulumi.com. And now if I'm in this directory and I try to do a Pulumi up, it's kind of going to assume that I want to, app is not the right answer, but I want to use app.pulumi.com. And so it's going to prompt me to give it a token, right? So it's like, go to Pulumi.com, generate a token. But I don't want to do that because I'm trying to use my storage account, right? So you cancel out of that. So you should never really have this stuff in your history. You should get a more secure way to do it, but that's what I did. So there's my storage account key for you guys to copy down. And I can get the storage account name. There it is. And so now it should have the basic information it needs to log me in if I do a Pulumi login cloud URL. AZ blob because we want to use Azure. And Pulumi is just the name of the container that my script created. So now it says I'm logged in. And now if I do something like a Pulumi preview, it's going to prompt me for that passphrase. So it says, tell me your secret passphrase, which I configured earlier when I did this. So if this was my first run through, it would say, ask me to create a stack and create a passphrase for the stack. So if I can type it right, I can get past this. And I did. So it's basically hinting, hey, there's an environment variable you can set that would, stop me from asking you this all the time. And it's the same stack. It's the virtual machine and the network, et cetera. So it should look familiar, but this time we're running in our backend is in Azure storage. So if I click on this permalink, I'm not going to go to, a nice web experience like app.pulumi.com, but I just get to see the actual stack itself, which currently is empty. I mean, all we can kind of see is the salt for the passphrase provider. So that's not super interesting, but I will go ahead and give it something to do. So I'll just make sure Pulumi up works. And again, it's going to ask me for that passphrase again, so I will opt out of that. There's my awesome passphrase. And it should do its thing where it's going to create its plan, and it will go ahead and ask me. I'm going to let it make those changes. So while it's making those initial changes, after we figure this out, the next challenge is kind of figuring out how to get that backend working with the Azure DevOps pipeline. And that is kind of the same deal. It's about it should be as simple as setting the same variables that we set interactively. The problem is there's a bug in the Pulumi task right now where it doesn't read the variables properly from the process environment. So when we try to inject secrets into that task, like the SAS token or the credentials, it doesn't find them. So It's also supported to what Pulumi calls the manual option is supported. So we can go ahead and basically write our own bash scripts or PowerShell scripts to do what needs to be done to do what the Pulumi task is doing under the hood. So there's a few things like I just use the storage account key when running locally, and that works, but that's not really a best practice. So what I got working for this pipeline was a temporary key. So, you know, this storage key script will just generate a new temporary key that only lasts an hour. I went ahead and just gave it all the permissions possible because I haven't gotten around to figuring out what the minimum are. And then finally, it puts that token back out into the pipeline as a secret using this special logging command that Azure DevOps pipelines support. And after that, since we're going the manual route, we also need to provide all of the Azure service principal credentials to the to Pulumi. Like so, with the Pulumi task, it was getting those from the service connection. So, but when we're just running Pulumi in a script, it needs to look for those inside of environment variables. And with when I'm running it locally, it's just using my local login. So this environment setup is just a way to like take that service connection information and again inject it out into the pipeline as more secrets. So finally, we end up with the actual Pulumi run. The whole thing and this time collapses down to a single task because since I was going to write the script anyways, there was really no point in having two different tasks. So we inject all of our secrets. You know, some of these are coming from our like an Azure DevOps variable library. Again, others are ones we either grabbed in earlier scripts or generated in earlier scripts. We go and we get the latest version of Pulumi, and we log in the same way that I logged in locally. And we do a stack select where I just give it the stack name. The stack was already selected when I ran it locally, but again, that's an interactive prompt that I want to avoid. So I just tell it ahead of time which stack to use inside the container. And again, right now I only have one stack, but again, we could have potentially many stacks inside the same container, so it needs to know which one to use. Then we have some beautiful bash if statements that kind of evaluate to the same things with conditions we already looked at. So the top half is looking for whether it's a pull request and running preview in that case, and the bottom half is looking for those CI builds and running Pulumi up. And so this all should pretty much work the same way. But because I have it all configured in the same repo, I didn't, of course, when I started out, realize that would be a bad idea, but I don't want all of these pipelines running all the time. So I just need to go update my branch policies to make sure that I'm looking at the one that I want to use right now. So I don't care about that old pipeline anymore. And back to my other branch policy, I want to switch that to be the new pipeline as well. So once that's all set, then I also have to go over here and tell Azure DevOps that I don't care about this pipeline anymore either. So I just go here to settings and tell it that, you know, I don't care. And I have a completely different project for the other guy. And I need to tell Azure DevOps that I do want to run this one now. So that's on. So now GitHub is expecting this pipeline to run, and now Azure DevOps will cooperate because the pipeline is enabled. So if I, again, make some change, I just deployed all of my resources. So if I go in here and I, you know, make some change, like let's go for something large, you know, like let's just change everything, right? And who knows if this will work, but you know, time will run out and then I can just run away. So we're gonna have better names, actually, better names for everything. We'll push that out and start our first pull request. actually, given, well, yeah, let's do a pull request. So we just go here and we say we want to start a new pull request into development. And that should appear shortly. And if everything is lined up correctly, then it's aware that it needs to wait for that pipeline to run, but it's not it's out of date with develop. That is true, it is out of date with develop. So let's fix that. I didn't do what I said I should do, which is, it doesn't think it's out of date. I'll let GitHub do it. I should have merged origin develop. That's why it didn't do anything. All right, so that's actually should be canceling this, the first build that it tried to do. Like, so yeah, so GitHub let Azure DevOps know that I had made additional changes, and it just went ahead and got rid of this job for me since it wasn't relevant anymore. And now it's running a new job for that. And so to go through the process here of generating storage key, environmental setup, basically getting all of our secrets lined up. And the bash script should notice that it should run in preview mode after it gets done logging us into our backend. And so we see it chose to run Pulumi preview. So a few things to note about that while this runs. Wrong button. See if we can get out of it that way. There we go. Which is that again, this is what we covered, right? We have all these things we need to set up inside of our pipeline. This was the big gotcha, which is that there is a role which that service principal running in a pipeline needs to have, which is the storage blob data contributor role. If it doesn't have that role, even if it's the owner of the account, it won't be able to generate a properly working SaaS token because it signs the token as itself. And then when Azure, unwraps that token, it realizes that, this person's not this service principal is not authorized to operate on the data and the role in the container. And then so everything just fails. And that was a lot of fun figuring out. So let's see. And so it ran its preview. So this is now something that we can merge, right? You can see it's doing a lot of changes though, right? So let's see, so I changed the suffix of everything. So now everything wants to have a dash demo instead of just the Pulumi DevOps in it. So my NSG wants the dash demo, and everybody wants that now because it's just passed all over the place. So what's happening is, again, Pulumi is it's doing kind of a combination of like adds and deletes in place. In some cases, like it's doing it shows up as a plus minus, but in reality, what it's just going to do is going to try and do it all in parallel. It's just going to build me a whole new resource group with a new VM in it, et cetera. And for the most part, it's just going to say, well, I'm just going to build you this new stuff and just get rid of all this old stuff for you, which is what you want it to do. But it's a little like when you read the plan, it looks like two operations, but it's really just doing what you asked it to do, which is rename everything. So at the bottom, you can see it's going to get rid of 7 things, and there's 2 things, which it decides it's just like more of a rename, even though it really all is. We can merge that in. And then again, that just takes us to develop, which doesn't do anything in itself. But if we go back here, we see that there's another change waiting for develop. or not, but we can make one. So if we put develop in the main, should be able to create a pull request. That's weird. And it's kicking off another validation build. And once that validation build merges, again, it's going to pretty much work the same way as the last one did, except this time it's going to do a lot more work. So while that runs, again, my kind of takeaways are that Pulumi is fun. I don't know if it's just because it's a shiny new toy, or again, like it feels good to be writing C# again. There's a lot more to learn. Like I definitely I took us to the point of we're using a storage account, but you know the passphrase protection on the secrets is kind of weak. So I do know just from reading the docs that we can use Key Vault for that instead. Oh yeah, really.
Did we lose Jim?
I lost him.
You lost me for a second. Let me reshare.
Did you get internet issues?
No, electrical issues. The whole.
Oh.
Yeah. So the power must have gone off in the neighborhood. I mean, we have solar panels, but there's a blink when they switch over to that power. So anyways, it's a good thing I was wrapping up, and it's also a good thing that all of this stuff is running in pipelines, because it really doesn't matter if my power runs out if as long as Azure still has power, right? Anyways, there's a lot more that I would like to dig into as far as Key Vault and like I said, like the things that we would get from having language. I hardly written any Pulumi code. I was just really messing around with the pipelines and stuff this time, but like what would it really look like if we did like some really nice clean infrastructure code in C# or TypeScript. As I mentioned, it's hard for me as someone who's been using Terraform for a long time to get used to the idea that there's no plan, no saved plan, no way to queue that up and say, okay, this is what we're going to deploy next. I think the branching strategy may work. I definitely would like to talk to more people who've been using Pulumi in the real world to figure out what they're doing, because I don't really like the idea. Although I kind of like see how the branching strategy works, I don't really like the idea of being forced into a specific branching strategy by the tool. And again, with any infrastructure as code tool, I'd say, always remember to review the preview, because, your infrastructure as code tools are very powerful, and you've got to take responsibility for wielding that power. Just check on our deployment and see how it's going. Or actually, we were still running a preview, I think, the final preview. So this should have passed by now, or not. Well, this is a good, so like there seems to be some kind of community. Oh, there it goes. It finally got there. I was going to say, again, this is kind of why we have to, I built myself the escape valve of, just saying, just deploy it, right? But it looks like the communication between DevOps and GitHub finally kicked in. So if we actually merge this, then we should see some changes actually run through on this next build. But that's pretty much it. So I'm kind of out of stuff to say. Like I said, as you guys have seen, as we've been working, the code's all on GitHub. if you want to take a look at it or play with it. And other than that, thanks for having me, and let me know if there's any last questions. Other than that, I'll move it over here so we can just watch text scroll by, my favorite pastime.
I do love watching text scroll by. We'll see if any questions are coming in as we do that. Well, Jim, thanks for being here tonight. We appreciate it. And way to play cool during a power outage. That's our first one.
Yeah, no kidding. We did have one question on YouTube. I don't know if anybody mentioned this. It's very important. It just says, how is Jim so awesome? Jim, could you get us a little insight into that?
Practice, mostly.
Oh.
Well, I try to, work with awesome people. I have a friend who works at Pulumi, so I'm definitely going to be hitting him up with some of these questions soon. But really, I have no explanation. I'm pretty sure that question is fake news anyways.
I don't think so.
Awesome. Well, I don't see any questions coming in, so let's jump to, I'm going to share my screen again. And make sure you get the right one here. Okay. So as far as announcements this time, there is the tiny URL. This is the URL we spoke of earlier that will give you the ability to rate the presentation as well as enter the drawing tonight. I would recommend you hit that URL now. We'll be watching to see the entries come in here momentarily. Also, we have a Slack channel. It's a great place to talk. I've noticed that there's been some job postings there lately, so it's always a great place to be connected and network. But also, always good conversation happening about .NET there. So check that out if you're not there already. You may see some sad news here. The cancellation of our microcon. We're sad to cancel it, but we have a couple of reasons to cancel. First of which, we're committed to being diverse here and promoting diversity. We tried really hard to find diverse speakers for our microcon, and we were not able to do so. And we want to kind of make a statement and say we promote diversity, so we're deciding to cancel because of that. Also, it is a conflict with the .NET Con. Am I saying that right? So a couple of reasons to cancel there. We'd love to hear your feedback on it though, and potentially there could be a microcon in 2021. So if there's excitement about the loss of it, help us to find some diverse speakers, and we'll love to do it. Okay, a lot of this information is available on our website. The URL is there. I think I already called out the tiny URL with SLC prize for prizes. If not, now is a really good time to do that because I can only delay so long.
I think I'm going to stop the live stream now if that's okay with everybody.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, good call.